Hi there, welcome back to English Building Blocks. Today we're going to discuss relative clauses. Now we're going to explain what those relative clauses are, how to use them correctly, and the difference between defining and non-defining relative clauses. Okay? Now remember, if you like these videos, please subscribe. Okay? Thank you very much. And now let's have a look at those relative clauses. Now, what is a relative clause, right? Imagine you have a sentence with, on the one hand, a main clause, and on the other hand, you have a relative clause, right? Then the main clause contains the most important information, the key information, okay? Whereas the relative clause has additional or more information about the person, the thing, or the place you are talking about, okay? For example, the boy who is sitting over there is my neighbor. So what is the main clause in this sentence? What is the most important part of this sentence? Well, obviously this is the boy is my neighbor. That is the key information I want to give you. But then we also have a relative clause giving additional information. Okay, the boy who is sitting over there. That specific boy, okay? And that is our relative clause, okay? Another example. I don't know the car which is parked in front of my house. So again, what is the main clause? What is the most important part of this sentence? Well, obviously this is that I don't know the car. Okay, that is the key information. That is our main clause. But furthermore, we have a relative clause giving additional information about that car. The car which is parked in front of my house. Okay, and that is our relative clause. Okay, now it is important to point out that we can use the relative clause in the middle or at the end of the sentence. So in our first example, we used it in the middle. The boy who is sitting over there is my neighbor, okay? And in the second example, we used it at the end. I don't know the car which is parked in front of my house, okay? Now, what is the difference between a defining and a non-defining relative clause? Well, when a relative clause is defining, then we use that relative clause to define, specify, or identify exactly who or what we are talking about. Okay? For example, my friend who plays rugby wants to come and visit me. So here we use the relative clause to define who my friend is. What friend am I talking about? Well, my friend who plays rugby, that friend. Okay, so here we use the defining relative clause to define who my friend is. Okay, so you know who I am talking about. On the other hand, a non-defining relative clause is used to give extra information. We don't need to define the person or the thing because we already know. We just give extra information, okay? For example, my mother, who lives in Belgium, is retired. So obviously, I only have one mum, so you know who I am talking about. Maybe you don't know my mum personally, but that is not important. You know who I am talking about, okay? And that's why we use a non-defining relative clause. My mother, who lives in Belgium, is retired, okay? Good. So, let's have a look at the characteristics of a defining relative clause. Firstly, we do not use commas, okay? Now, there are no commas, not before, not after our relative clause when it is defining. For example, the house which we remodeled last year has been demolished. So you see, there are no commas, not before and not after our relative clause, okay? And that's because it's a defining relative clause. Secondly, when we use the relative pronouns who or what, we can substitute them by that. So if we use the same example, then we could also say the house that we remodeled last year has been demolished. So you see, we can substitute which by that, and it has the same meaning, okay? And lastly, when our relative pronoun which, who, or that is the object of the relative clause, then we can omit it. We can leave it out. Okay, now you're asking me, how do I know when our relative pronoun who, which, or that is the object? Well, it's fairly easy. When you look at your relative clause and between the relative pronoun who, which, or that and your principal verb, there is a subject, then your relative pronoun is the object and you can omit it, okay? Again, same example. The house which we remodeled last year has been demolished. So we see between which and the principal verb remodeled, there is a subject, we, okay? And that means we can omit the relative pronoun. So we could also say the house we remodeled last year has been demolished. And you see, we don't use a relative pronoun here, okay? Another example. The girl who I was talking to studies at university. So here we have the relative pronoun who and the principal verb I was talking to. So you see there is a subject, I, in between, which again implies that who is the object, which means that we can omit it, we can leave it out. So we could also say the girl I was talking to studies at university. So you see, we leave out the relative pronoun who, okay? So now let's talk about the characteristics of these non-defining relative clauses. Firstly, in this case, you do have to use commas, okay? For example, I'm going to sell my car, which I bought 10 years ago. So obviously this is a non-defining relative clause because you know what I am talking about. I am talking about my car, right? And in this case, as the relative clause is at the end of the sentence, we only use a comma before the relative clause, okay? I'm going to sell my car, comma, which I bought 10 years ago, okay? Now, if our relative clause is in the middle of the sentence, then we use commas before and after our relative clause, okay? For example, my boss who is on holidays at the moment is easygoing. So again, you know this is a non-defining relative clause because you know who I am talking about. I am talking about my boss, okay? And you see we use commas before and after our relative clause. My boss, comma, who is on holidays at the moment, comma, is easy going, okay? Now, secondly, in this case, using those non-defining relative clauses, we cannot substitute who or which by that. You can only use who or which. So going back to our examples, right? I'm going to sell my car, which, not that, which I bought 10 years ago, okay? Or my boss, who, and not that, who is on holidays at the moment is easy going, okay? Now, thirdly and lastly, when we use those relative pronouns, who or which, then we cannot omit them, even if they are the object, okay? You always use your relative pronouns. Same example, I'm going to sell my car, which I bought 10 years ago. So clearly, which is the object because there is a subject between which and bought, which is I, okay? But I still have to use my relative pronoun, which I cannot omit it, okay? Good. Now, let's have a look at two examples. They look very, very similar. The only difference is we use commas in one and we don't in the other. But do they mean the same? Let's find out. So, my brother, who lives in London, is a salesman. So you see in the first sentence, we don't use commas, and in the second sentence, we use commas. So the first sentence is a defining relative clause, and the second sentence is a non-defining relative clause. So now you can pause the video if you want to find out what the difference is in meaning. Now, the difference in meaning is when you use a defining relative clause, so you don't use the commas, then you need to define the brother you are talking about, which means that you have more than one brother, okay? On the other hand, when you use the commas, when you use a non-defining relative clause, then you don't need to define the brother because you only have one brother. You just give extra information, okay? And that is the difference between these two sentences. So we can also use other question words like where, when, or whose, okay? Obviously, when using where, you're referring to a place. When using when, you're referring to a time. And when using whose, you're referring to a possession, okay? Now, when using these question words where, when, and whose, then you can never omit them, okay? Why? Easy enough, because they will never be the object of your relative clause, okay? So you can never omit where, when, or whose in a relative clause, independently if it's defining or non-defining, okay? For example, the restaurant where we had lunch yesterday is closed today. So in this case, this is a defining relative clause, specifying the restaurant, defining the restaurant, right? and we cannot omit the question word where we need to use it. The restaurant where we had lunch yesterday is closed today. But the same goes in a non-defining relative clause. For example, my house where we had lunch yesterday is getting painted. In this case, it's a non-defining relative clause, right? Because we know the place I'm talking about. But again, we need to use that question word where. My house where we had lunch yesterday is getting painted. So we cannot omit that question word where. Okay. Another example now with when. The day when you're arriving is marked on my calendar. So in this case, this is a defining relative clause, defining the day, okay? And again, we cannot omit the question word when. We need to use it. The day when you're arriving is marked on my calendar, okay? And the last example using whose. Jane, whose phone was stolen the other day, has already bought a new one. In this case, we use a non-defining relative clause because we know we're talking about Jane and her possession, okay? And again, we cannot omit the question word, in this case, whose, okay? We need to use whose. Jane, whose phone was stolen the other day, has already bought a new one, okay? So, to sum up, a relative clause is used to give additional extra information about a person, a thing, a place we are talking about. And there are two ways to do this. On the one hand, we can use defining relative clauses, defining, specifying, identifying exactly the person, the thing, the place, and so on I am talking about, okay? And in such case, then you need to remember not to use commas, right? Secondly, you can substitute who or which by the relative pronoun that. And remember that you can omit who, which, or that when it is the object of the relative clause, okay? Or on the other hand, we have a non-defining relative clause, and this is used only to give extra information about the person, the thing, the place we are talking about. We don't need to define that person, thing, or place because we already know who, what, or where. This is just extra information, okay? And in such case, then remember to use commas. You can never use that to substitute who or which. And lastly, you always need to use your relative pronoun, even if it is the object of your relative clause, okay? Now, thank you for watching. I hope you have learned something, and if so, subscribe, right? Click the notification bell, leave a comment down below, or just give a thumbs up, okay? Now again, thank you for watching. Till next time, bye-bye.